Have you ever wondered why the best stories always seem to be about good and evil? You know, we love stories as human beings. Telling stories, hearing them, reading them, listening to them is part of what makes us uniquely human. You know, my kids are 6 and 9. They love stories. They love reading them. They love sitting there and listening to them. And we love watching them as a family, whether it's on TV shows or movies. You know, we love stories, don't we, as human beings? But I noticed a few months ago, I was reflecting on this, that, you know, isn't it interesting that the stories that are perhaps the greatest stories, the best stories, certainly the stories that have survived for the longest, all concern the theme of good and evil. I mean, consider a modern classic like the Harry Potter novels and the movies. That story is all about good and evil. You have good represented by Harry and his friends, and then you have evil represented by Voldemort and so forth. The whole story is about, well, who will triumph? Or consider a slightly older modern classic, my favourite series of novels, the Lord of the Rings books. And you know, that classic, in fact, I think it's the best-selling novel of all time, last time I checked. You know, Tolkien has made that story so successful by building into it those great themes of good, represented by things like the hobbits, Bilbo and Frodo, and the elves, and Aragorn, and so on. And on the other side, you have the forces of evil, represented by Sauron and Mordor and the orcs, and so on. In both those stories, the Harry Potter novels, the Lord of the Rings stories, the whole story circulates and pivots on who will win. Will evil win, or will good triumph? Well, why are we so fascinated by stories like that? Why is it the best stories are about good and evil? I just wonder, could it be because those stories are reflections in some small way of the much bigger story of the universe? Because I don't believe that we're living in an accidental universe where all that's going on are atoms and particles knocking together. I believe that there's a story to this universe. I believe there's a God behind this world who created it with a structure and a direction and a narrative to it. A God who can give us those categories of good and evil to talk about in the first place. But when it comes to story, though, I wonder if you've noticed a couple of other things. Stories are hugely important because it's from stories that we learn a couple of things. First, it's from stories that we learn what good and evil mean in the first place. You know, good and evil depend on what story you find yourself in. See, if you are living in a godless story, if you're living in the atheist story that says the only thing that in existence are atoms and particles, that as human beings we're just the result of time plus chance plus natural selection, well, it's very hard to even use words like good and evil. What do they even mean? On the other hand, if the Christian story is true, if the story of Jesus, the story of the Bible is true, that gives us a language and a structure, a reality behind which this universe, that means we can actually even use words like good and evil in the first place. But then the other thing that's interesting is when we think about stories and value for a moment. Value is partly determined by the story that you're living in as well. I had my eyes open to this just very recently. In fact, when I was talking to a friend of mine who's an archaeologist, and he was telling me very excitedly how he and a bunch of fellow archaeologists just made this amazing discovery in the part of the country where they do their work. They uncovered this cache of medieval gold sovereigns, about 50 or 60 of these coins, and a very exciting discovery, and these coins are now off at the British Museum being valued. And he went on to tell me the value that's assigned will partly depend on story. If there was no backstory to these coins, they're just a bunch of coins in a hole in the ground, they'll be worth, he said, maybe if we're lucky, 40, 50,000 pounds. On the other hand, if there's a story that we can find out about these coins, you know, when they were buried, the time they date from, up the road there was a castle being built. Maybe these coins are connected with that. Maybe one of the workmen there stole these from the local lord and then ran away and buried them, and something happened, never came back and collected his ill-gotten gains. He said if we can identify the story connected to these items, then the value could skyrocket and be as much as £250,000. See, value flows from the story that you're living in. Again, if you're living in the atheistic story where nothing more is going on than atoms and particles, very hard to find a basis for human value. On the other hand, if the story behind the universe is the one the Bible tells, of a God who created you in his image, a God who loves you dearly and has demonstrated that in so many ways, not least in the gift he gave to us of Jesus, then human value flows very naturally from that story. Have you ever wondered if story really matters? And have you ever wondered which story you are really living in?